I want you to picture a specific image. It's arguably one of the most famous, or maybe infamous, images in American political history. A man in a T-shirt, wearing sunglasses, sitting on a dock. Maybe there's a boat involved. And the name of that boat is Monkey Business.
It's the punchline that defined a whole decade. I mean, if you stop someone on the street and say, Gary Hart, that is the immediate association.
That's it.
The blonde woman, the boat, the scandal, the total fall from grace.
Right. It's the moment political journalism just turned into something, I don't know, something different. But here is the paradox, and it is a really jarring one. If you leave that dock and fast forward to the first week of September 2001, specifically September 6th, you find that same man, the punchline, sitting in a meeting with the National Security Advisor of the United States. And he isn't talking about scandals. He's predicting, with like a terrifying specificity, that a massive terrorist attack is about to happen on U.S. soil.
It is one of those historical what-ifs that just keeps you up at night. You have a man who was, well, arguably the most forward-thinking political strategist of his generation, completely sidelined by a sex scandal.
Completely.
And there he is, trying to warn the government about 9/11 literally 5 days before it happened.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into the life and career of Gary Hart. And the mission here is quite specific. We aren't here to just rehash the gossip for the sake of gossip.
Yeah.
We have a massive stack of sources here. Senate records, biographical files, declassified commission reports.
Right.
We're going to unpack how a farm boy from Kansas became the Atari Democrat, analyze the exact timeline of the scandal that destroyed him, because the popular story is actually wrong, and look at those warnings he gave in 2001.
And I think the key here is to view Hart not just as a failed politician, but as a case study in how American politics has evolved. He really bridges the gap. I mean, he started in the era of smoke-filled rooms, and he ended up as the first casualty of the 24-hour news cycle.
He's patient zero.
He is patient zero for modern political media. Absolutely.
He didn't just see the rules change. In a lot of ways, he broke the old rules and kind of forced the new ones into existence.
Yeah.
But to understand the fall, we have to understand the ascent. And looking at his early life, the first thing that struck me in the biographical data is that Gary Hart didn't actually exist for the first 25 years of his life.
No, he didn't. He was born Gary Warren Hartpence.
Hartpence. That's a mouthful.
It is. In Ottawa, Kansas, his father was a farm equipment salesman. It was a pretty modest, very religious upbringing in the heartland. But that name change is really the first clue to his character. It wasn't some Hollywood stage name. In 1961, Gary and his father actually went to the courthouse together to change the family name.
Together? That's interesting.
Yeah, and the reasoning they gave was just incredibly pragmatic. Hart is just easier to remember and spell than Hartpence.
Which is true from a branding perspective. I mean, Senator Hartpence sounds a bit
Real stuffy, yeah.
But it does suggest a certain level of calculation, doesn't it? Even at a young age, this idea of streamlining your own identity.
Absolutely. It speaks to a desire for efficiency. And you see that pivot in his education as well. He went to Southern Nazarene University, a very strict religious school, and then he goes on to Yale Divinity School.
So he was on a track to become a minister or a philosopher.
Right. He wanted to save souls. But then, almost abruptly, he graduates in 1961 and literally walks across the campus to enroll in Yale Law School.
The shift from the laws of God to the laws of men.
Exactly. And while the sources don't give us, a diary entry explaining the exact moment of the decision, the trajectory shifts from spiritual leadership to practical systemic leadership. He goes to work for the Department of Justice, then the Department of the Interior. Pretty standard stuff.
But the moment where he stops being a bureaucrat and starts being a political architect is 1972.
The George McGovern campaign. Now, historically, McGovern is, of course, remembered for losing to Nixon in one of the biggest landslides ever.
A total wipeout.
But the primary campaign, that was something else entirely. And Hart was the campaign director.
This is where we have to get into the weeds a little bit of how American politics actually works, because Hart effectively hacked the system.
He really did. Before 1972, the Democratic nominee was largely chosen by party bosses, the Mayor Daleys of the world.
The guys in the smoke-filled rooms.
Exactly. But after the chaos of the 1968 convention in Chicago, the party opened up the process. They created this new, really complex system of primaries and caucuses.
And most of the old guard, the establishment, they didn't really understand the new rule book.
Correct. But Gary Hart and his colleague Rick Stearns did. They looked at the new rules and treated them like a logic puzzle. They realized that while all the big names, Muskie, Humphrey, were fighting over the expensive primary states with TV ads and big rallies,
Spending all the money.
there were 28 states that held caucuses.
Okay, so for you, the listener, who might not know, what is the functional difference there that Hart was able to exploit?
It's a great question. A primary is simple voting. You walk in, you pull a lever, or fill out a bubble, you leave. A caucus is a meeting.
It's a commitment.
It's a huge commitment. It requires neighbors talking to neighbors in a school gym for hours. It requires time and, most importantly, organization. Hart realized that caucuses were cheap in terms of dollars, but really expensive in terms of effort.
So he built a grassroots army.
A huge one. They focused on these completely ignored states, organizing thousands of volunteers to show up at these meetings on a Tuesday night in, Iowa or Nebraska. It was a Moneyball approach to politics way before that term existed.
They were looking for undervalued assets on the political map.
Precisely. And it worked. McGovern just swept the nomination, shocking the entire establishment. Now, the general election was a disaster, we know that, but
Right.
inside the party, Gary Hart walked away with this reputation as a whiz kid. He was the guy who saw the Matrix.
And he didn't waste any time cashing in on that reputation.
Yeah.
Just 2 years later, 1974, he moves to Colorado and runs for the U.S. Senate.
And his timing was impeccable. 1974 is the year of Watergate.
Of course.
The Republican brand was just radioactive. Hart ran against an incumbent, Peter Dominick, who had not only supported Nixon, but was also suffering from some health issues. So Hart runs as the fresh face, the outsider, the reformer.
And he wins in a landslide, 57.2% of the vote.
Huge margin.
So now he is Senator Hart. And looking at his Senate record in the provided files, he wasn't a backbencher. He seemed to gravitate toward the heavy, complex committees almost immediately.
Oh, he was incredibly active. He landed a seat on the Church Committee. For those not familiar with 70s history, the Church Committee was a massive, massive investigation into the intelligence abuses of the CIA, the NSA, the FBI.
This was really dark stuff.
Oh, yeah. They were looking into assassination plots, illegal domestic surveillance on anti-war protesters. This is where Hart gets his first deep exposure to the national security apparatus, and it clearly shapes him.
And then there's the 3 Mile Island incident in 1979. There's a detail in the source material that I found pretty wild. He wasn't just reading reports about the nuclear meltdown.
Yeah.
He was physically there.
He was the chairman of the subcommittee on nuclear regulation. So when the reactor accident happened, he didn't manage it from a desk in D.C.
No.
He flew to Pennsylvania and went up in an Army helicopter directly over the reactor to assess the situation while the crisis was still unfolding.
That's incredible.
It showed a kind of physical courage and a hands-on style that really separated him from the typical lawyer-politician archetype.
But the label that really came to define him, and the one that I think is most interesting for us to unpack, is Atari Democrat.
Right.
It sounds so retro now, like calling someone a Betamax Republican.
Right.
But in the context of the early 80s, what was he trying to signal with that term?
It was a declaration of a new kind of liberalism. You have to remember, the Democratic Party of the 1970s and 80s was still built on the New Deal coalition. Heavy industry, big labor unions, protectionism.
The Rust Belt.
The Rust Belt, exactly. Hart looked at the world and saw the information age coming. Atari Democrat meant a moderate who believed the government should partner with the tech sector, encourage entrepreneurship, and move away from that old industrial reliance.
It was about shifting the focus from steel mills to silicon chips.
That's the perfect way to put it. And he backed it up with legislation. He co-sponsored the Semiconductor Chip Protection Act of 1984.
Okay, what did that do? Why was that a big deal?
Well, it was a landmark bill. Before this, you could basically take a computer chip, photograph the layout of the transistors, what they call the mask work, and just clone it. There was no intellectual property protection for the physical design of a chip.
So it was the Wild West for tech.
Totally. And Hart helped create a new category of IP law specifically to protect Silicon Valley from foreign copycats. He was thinking about this stuff years before most people in Washington even knew what a microchip was.
So he's identifying the economic future of the country. He's a military reformer, pushing for smaller, more mobile units rather than massive battleships. He's checking all these visionary boxes. But politically, he almost flamed out in 1980.
Oh, it was a very close call. 1980 was the Reagan Revolution. Republicans swept the country. Hart barely, and I mean barely, held onto a seat in Colorado.
How close was it?
He won by roughly 1%, just over 19,000 votes. His opponent, Mary Istel Buchanan, attacked him as a McGovernate carpetbagger, trying to tie him to the old left, saying he was too liberal for Colorado.
And what was the specific attack line?
A lot of it centered on his support for the Panama Canal treaties, which was seen as giving away the canal. It was a very effective conservative talking point at the time.
So that close call spooked him.
It had to. He realized that if he wanted to be president, he couldn't just be the smart guy or the ideas guy. He needed to be the tough guy, too.
Which brings us to a very strange chapter in his biography, the Naval Reserve. This feels like a subplot that a scriptwriter would add to make a character more complex, but in real life, it just seems odd.
It is very peculiar.
Why does a sitting United States senator in his 40s decide to join the Navy?
It's a great question. The stated reason, which Hart has always maintained, is that he didn't feel comfortable voting on military matters, specifically the potential for conflict in the Persian Gulf, without understanding the military from the inside.
So he was saying, I don't want to send young men to war if I haven't served.
That was the line. He said he didn't want to send young men to die in a service he didn't understand, which sounds noble on paper.
But the critics at the time didn't buy it.
Not for a second. Columnists like Evans and Novak just savaged him for it. They called it clearing the biographical decks.
What does that mean?
Well, you have to look at the landscape of the time. JFK, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, they all had military service records. It was practically a prerequisite for the presidency. Hart was the odd man out. So the cynical view is that he was just checking a box on his resume for a future presidential run.
And the application process itself was riddled with irregularities, right?
Oh, it was messy. He was over the age limit for a commission. He was, I think, 43 at the time. He had no prior experience. And in what becomes a recurring theme for Hart, there were discrepancies on his forms regarding his birth date.
He got his own birthday wrong.
Again, it happened more than once in public documents. It added to this low-level hum of suspicion that he was constantly reinventing himself, shaving a year off here or there.
So how did he get in?
He got a waiver from the Secretary of the Navy, Edward Hidalgo. But here is a fascinating connection. The Senate liaison for the Navy who helped smooth this whole process over was none other than John McCain.
No way.
Yeah.
That is a wild connection.
They actually became friends through the process. Hart was commissioned as a lieutenant junior grade. He apparently wanted a higher rank, but the Navy held firm that he had no experience. He did his active duty tours, but politically it was a wash. It just looked too calculated to a lot of people.
But despite the cynicism, he gears up for the big show, 1984. He decides to run for president. And this is really the rehearsal for the tragedy that comes later.
It really is. 1984 is where he proves he's a heavyweight. He announces early, in February of 1983, and he is polling at an asterisk, like 1%.
A total nobody on the national stage.
Completely. He is running against Walter Mondale, the former vice president and the embodiment of the Democratic establishment, and John Glenn, an American hero, an astronaut. Hart is a nobody outside of Colorado and D.C.
So he goes back to the 1972 McGovern playbook.
He does. He realizes he can't outspend Mondale, so he decides to outwork him in the early states. He goes to New Hampshire way, way before anyone else. He campaigns on this theme of new ideas. That was the slogan. It was a brilliant frame. Mondale was the past. Hart was the future. And it worked.
He won New Hampshire by 10 points. I mean, that is a political earthquake.
It was a massive upset. Suddenly, Gary Hart is on the cover of Time and Newsweek. He's being called the new JFK. He has the hair, the look, the Atari platform. Mondale is reeling. The entire establishment is terrified.
But then we have one of the most famous moments in debate history, the "where's the beef" moment. I think people know the punchline, but let's analyze why it was so incredibly effective.
It's a perfect case study in political jiu-jitsu. Mondale is being attacked as old and boring. Hart was new ideas. But during a debate, Mondale turns to Hart and uses a slogan from a hugely popular Wendy's hamburger commercial.
Everyone knew this ad.
Oh, yeah, it was iconic. And he said, "When I hear your new ideas, I'm reminded of that ad. Where's the beef?"
The audience just erupted.
They did. But the reason it worked wasn't just because it was a funny, timely reference. It struck at Hart's biggest vulnerability. People thought he was cool, he was aloof, he was intellectual, but they weren't sure there was any real substance behind the new ideas slogan.
So Mondale was saying, this guy is all packaging.
He's all sizzle and no steak. Exactly.
It halted Hart's momentum cold. It gave the media and the voters a simple, powerful narrative to latch onto.
Hart fought all the way to the convention in San Francisco, but Mondale had the delegates by then.
He did, but it was the last time a nomination was truly contested that late into the game, and Hart went out swinging. He told the convention, "This is one Hart you will not leave in San Francisco."
That's a great line.
It was a promise. He was telling the world, "I'll be back in 1988 and I'm gonna win this time."
And for 3 years, that seemed inevitable. Going into the 1988 cycle, he wasn't just a frontrunner, he was the guy.
Oh, he was the prohibitive favorite. He was polling double digits ahead of everyone. The path was completely clear for him to be the next president of the United States. But there was noise in the background. Rumors.
The womanizing rumors. It was something of an open secret in D.C. that Hart had a complex marriage. He and his wife Lee had separated twice in 79 and 81, though they always reconciled.
He called it a midlife crisis, right?
He did, but there were constant whispers about affairs, about him not being, a faithful husband.
And this brings us to the scandal. And this is where we need to be very precise because the popular memory of this event is actually wrong. The story everyone knows is Hart arrogantly taunted the press, dared them to follow him, so they did, and they caught him.
That is the myth.
Yeah.
It's a very convenient narrative because it makes the whole scandal Hart's fault for being arrogant. But the timeline and the sources, it tells a very different story.
Okay, let's break down that timeline. The feminist quote is finding, "Follow me around, I don't care. If anybody wants to put a tail on me, go ahead, they'll be very bored."
Right. He gave that quote to E.J. Dionne of the New York Times for a magazine piece. But, and this is absolutely crucial, that interview had not been published yet when the Miami Herald began their investigation.
So the Herald wasn't accepting some kind of challenge.
No. The Herald received an anonymous tip. A phone call from a woman who claimed her friend was having an affair with Hart and that she even had photos. So the Herald flew a team to D.C. and staked out his townhouse based entirely on that tip, not on a dare.
And the quote from the Times.
Here's the crazy part. The quote appeared in the New York Times Magazine on Sunday, May 3rd. That was the exact same day that the Miami Herald published its story about the stakeout.
Oh, wow. What a collision.
It was a cosmic collision of bad timing. It made Hart look incredibly hubristic, as if he was daring them while he was actively with Donna Rice. But the surveillance was already happening. The die was already cast.
So let's talk about that weekend, May 1st and 2nd, 1987. The stakeout itself.
It's just grim. You have these reporters sitting in rental cars watching the back door of a presidential candidate's home. They see a young woman, Donna Rice, coming and going with Hart's friend. Then they see her and Hart together.
And on Saturday evening, they decide to confront him.
In an alleyway.
In an alley. Sounds
Really?
like a movie.
It really does. Hart is walking near his townhouse. The reporters literally surround him. It's chaotic. They start firing questions at him. Who is the woman in your house? Is she staying with you? Hart denied everything. He was agitated. He claimed he was being set up.
But the optics were just fatal. The front runner for the presidency, cornered in an alley, trying to explain why a blonde model was in his house.
It was over at that moment, really. The story breaks the next day. And the media environment, the sources describe it as a frenzy that had never been seen before.
This was the Rubicon crossing. Before this, there was sort of the gentleman's agreement in the press.
There was. I mean, the press corps knew about FDR, they knew about JFK, they knew about LBJ, but they viewed it as private conduct that didn't impact their ability to govern. With Hart, the character issue became the dominant and really the only story.
The wall between public and private was demolished.
It was bulldozed. Overnight, the campaign turned from a debate about policy into a character inquisition. The Washington Post was preparing a story about another woman Hart had dated while he was legally separated from his wife. The pressure was just unbearable.
And on May 8th, just a week after the story broke, he suspended his campaign.
Just like that, it was over.
And his withdrawal speech, reading the transcript of it now, it's not apologetic, it's angry.
It is. It's defiant. He felt he was the victim of a media that had completely lost its way. He said, and this is a quote, "I watched journalists become animals, literally." But the most haunting part is when he paraphrased Thomas Jefferson.
What did he say?
He said, "I tremble for my country when I think we may, in fact, get the kind of leaders we deserve."
That is a heavy statement.
He was warning us. He was saying, if you make politics about peeping through keyholes and staking out people's homes, serious people with complex lives will stop running for office.
And you'll be left with what?
You're going to be left with people who are simply better at hiding things or people who have no shame at all.
He also talked about this idea of static.
Yes. He said that scandal creates static that drowns out the signal of real issues. And that concept becomes devastatingly, tragically relevant when we look at his post-political career.
He did try to jump back in briefly in December of '87, right? The Let the People Decide tour.
He did. It was a bizarre, almost quixotic attempt to restart his campaign. He thought maybe the voters didn't care as much as the press did.
He was wrong.
He was wrong. He was a punchline by then. He polled terribly and dropped out again for good after Super Tuesday. His electoral career was dead.
And usually in a biography, this is where the screen fades to black. The politician retires, maybe writes a memoir, plays golf. But for Gary Hart, this was arguably just the end of the first act.
This is where the story gets really substantive. Hart didn't disappear into obscurity. He went to Oxford, he earned a doctorate in politics, he completely reinvented himself again, this time as a serious scholar of national security.
And this brings us to the late '90s. President Clinton commissions Hart, along with former Republican Senator Warren Rudman, to lead a major study on national security, the Hart-Rudman Commission.
And this wasn't some fluff assignment to keep a former politician busy. They spent nearly 3 years analyzing the changing global landscape after the Cold War, and their conclusion was stark.
What did they find?
They said that the era of American invulnerability was over. They concluded that the U.S. homeland was now a primary target.
And they were specific about the nature of the threat.
Extremely specific. They warned that a terrorist attack involving mass casualties would occur on U.S. soil. They explicitly stated it wasn't a matter of if, but when. They published their final report in early 2001.
So now we are in 2001. George W. Bush is president. The report is out there, collecting dust on a shelf somewhere, I assume. But Hart didn't just file the report and walk away. He was actively sounding the alarm.
He was, and this is where the timeline becomes just chilling. Let's look at the week before 9/11.
Okay, September 4th, 2001.
Hart is in Montreal giving a speech. He publicly warns that within the next 25 years, a massive terrorist event will kill Americans on American soil. He is trying to get people to pay attention.
And then, September 6th, 5 days before the attacks.
This is the meeting that I think must haunt him. Hart goes to the White House to meet with Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor. He is there specifically to urge the Bush administration to move faster on the Hart-Rudman Commission's recommendations.
What did he tell her? Do we know?
We do. He was blunt. He told her, you must move more quickly on Homeland Security. An attack is going to happen. He was trying to cut through the bureaucracy to light a fire under them.
And the response?
According to Hart and later reports, the administration was polite but essentially dismissed the urgency. Their focus was elsewhere. They were looking at missile defense. They were looking at state actors like Iraq and China. The idea of a non-state actor using commercial planes as missiles, it just wasn't the frequency they were tuned into.
It really brings us back to his warning about static, doesn't it? The scandal in '87 destroyed his political viability. If he had been President Hart, or even just Senator Hart with his reputation intact, would that warning have been heeded?
That is the ultimate unanswerable question. The scandal didn't just remove a candidate from the field, it sidelined a mind that had correctly diagnosed the defining threat of the 21st century. Because he was viewed as damaged goods, his warnings were easier to ignore.
The static of his personal life drowned out the signal of his intelligence.
That's it. That's the tragedy.
It's unbelievable. But he did eventually find a way to serve again, in a different capacity.
He did. Under the Obama administration, from 2014 to 2017, he served as the U.S. Special Envoy for Northern Ireland. It's a very difficult, very delicate diplomatic role, helping to manage the peace process.
And the fact that he was chosen for that, what does that signal?
It shows that, at least within the serious circles of foreign policy, he had earned his redemption. He had proven he was the statesman he always claimed to be, despite the caricature.
I want to touch on one final aspect before we wrap up, the personal side. The scandal was ostensibly about protecting the sanctity of marriage. The press destroyed him to save the country from an adulterer.
Yeah.
But looking at the sources, the marriage survived.
It did. Gary and Lee Hart remained married until her death in 2021. And it wasn't a fairy tale. In public statements over the years, they were very honest about the fact that it was difficult. They admitted to the separations. They admitted to the pain. Hart said that the time they spent apart actually strengthened their marriage in the long run, but they chose to stay together.
It just defies the simple narrative, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The media treated it as a black and white morality play, but the reality was a complex, gray, Very human relationship that endured for over 60 years.
And in a way, that's the story of Gary Hart himself. He was never the caricature the media painted him as. He wasn't just the monkey business guy. He was a brilliant strategist, a flawed husband, a visionary policymaker, and a casualty of a changing culture.
He's even found this weird second life in pop culture.
He has. He's played by Hugh Jackman in the movie The Frontrunner. He shows up in references on Cheers and The Golden Girls.
But the weirdest one has to be Stephen King.
Oh, right. He's the president in Stephen King's Dark Tower universe. In that alternate timeline, he won in 1988.
A strange kind of immortality. To be the good president in a fantasy novel.
It shows that he remains this symbol of what could have been. It's a powerful idea.
So let's synthesize all this. We started with a farm boy who renamed himself for practical reasons.
Mm-hmm.
We saw the strategist who invented the modern caucus system, the Atari Democrat who foresaw the tech economy,
Then the scandal that changed journalism forever.
and the prophet who warned us about 9/11 when almost no one was listening.
It is a dense, complicated legacy.
The question I'm left with is the one we touched on earlier. Did the destruction of the wall between public and private life actually make us better off? We knew everything there was to know about Donna Rice. We knew nothing about the 19 terrorists training to fly planes in Florida.
That is the verdict of history, isn't it? In our obsession with the personal failings of our leaders, we distracted ourselves from the existential threats facing our nation. Hart warned us about the static. And looking back at that week in September 2001, it's just so hard to argue that we were listening to the right signal.
Which leaves us with a provocative thought. Sometimes the headline everyone is screaming about is just noise, and the real story, the one that actually matters, is in the quiet report that nobody's bothering to read.
Absolutely. The signal gets lost in the static.
That's it for this deep dive into the paradox of Gary Hart. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
We'll see you in the next one. Stay curious.